Right. Yeah. They're coming soon. There's a ton of deadlines that are due for my department right now, so I'm running a bit behind on getting those graded, but I will get those back to you before the end of the weekend for sure. Okay. You're not the only one, right? I'm not singling you out, right? Is that a hand or just a hair? Okay, I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Right. On Monday, somebody asked, what's that in his hand? And I did some research to figure this out. So hang on a second while I get logged on. And let's go back one here. Right. Mark's iPad is doing this. Thank you. Somebody had asked, what are those things in their hands, right? And I got ahead of myself here. So we were looking at armor at the very end of class, and then somebody said, what are those nubbins, right, that they have inside their hands? And I had never known, and I always wanted to find out. So I went ahead and did some research on it, and I found out that there are about 2 or 3 different ways that people have explained this. And one of them is that it's a way of showing them holding something that would have protruded like this. But in sculpture, when it's freestanding, that makes it difficult, right? Because it can break off easy. So some people suggest it's just sort of a remnant of that in 3 dimensions. A lot of people don't buy this anymore, but this was, the theory for a while. Then these are both these statues are in Boston. Then somebody else mentioned that sometimes you can find them with that nub in their hand. You can see it's in his fist, right? And if you look at it, yes. Now go away, right? That nub in his hand turns into 2 flanges down here, coming off the side, right? So what we're seeing at there is the end of a folded piece of fabric, okay, or leather. But I found out from researching that it's fabric, right? And this is exactly what we saw the sons and the daughters of Tembu carrying. Remember, each one of them had this in their hands down below as well. So it's a piece of fabric folded in half, and when they're standing like this, they're seeing it from the front. And that fabric folded in half makes a sort of bobby pin sort of shape. And in Egyptian hieroglyphs, that shape is the hieroglyph for health, right? So the idea here is that, remember, this is the place where the Ka is going to keep living after death. They're carrying this vague, very hard to understand symbol for eternal health, right? So that's the best explanation for what these things are, is in fact a symbol for the health of the soul, the Ka, which we were talking about before, that is going to reside in these figures, and the fact that the life goes on after death. Yeah. Which one? I don't really saw it last time. Yeah, exactly what it is. And it was in this piece, I think, because it hangs out kind of long off the back of it, right? And so that's something, if you took this class last year, you wouldn't have got, right? Let's see what's next, right? And so there you can see, is that what you're talking about there? You can see the last 2 sons have it in their hands, right? And so that seems most likely explanation for what that nub is. So we left off talking about, oh, hey, I didn't do this last time, I'm going to do it this time. Here comes the sign-in sheet, right? Because my higher-ups want me to do that. We left off talking about the palette of Narmer, and we were looking at the different tiers here. Hathor up above, Narmer drubbing one of his enemies into submission, his servant holding his sandals behind him, probably symbolic for holy ground. More defeated enemies down below. And then this odd thing, which seems to be a symbolic repetition of the central scene, where Horus, the falcon, who represents in many ways is parallel to Narmer, the pharaoh, is holding in submission one of the people of Lower Egypt. And we know this because there are these papyrus plants coming out of the back of this figure, and his head kind of coming out of the front of that, even though the figure is nothing more than just that block, right? So this is the same thing we're seeing here. Horus instead of Narmer, this thing instead of him, right? Now, that said, the other thing I found out between Tuesday and today, Monday and today, I found this object up in the Walters, and it shows the enemy in submission. I think it's a footrest or something. One of them has been carved away, right? You just put your feet on your enemy, yeah. But look at, if you think about that in profile, right? That thing kind of looks like what Horus is on top of, but without the fronds, doesn't it? He's laying down flat. His head comes up off this block. This object is a fairly rare object. Well, it's all Egyptian art. It's all rare. But this is, insofar as types of Egyptian art, this is kind of rare. But I'm wondering if that idea of why his body looks the way it does might be explained by an object such as this, right? At least help explain it. Okay, so the palette of Narmer that we were looking at is carved on both sides, as we mentioned on Monday. And on the back side of it is the well where the makeup would have been placed. But this thing is far too big to use. Well, it's about as big as your torso, and it's made out of stone. So it's not likely that it was ever made to be used, but it's an object that was created specifically to be buried with Narmer, right? And you see there's Hathor up above again, right? Now, can you tell me where Narmer is on this side? Yeah? He's the one with the crown. And how do you know, other than the crown, is there anything else that tells you that's Narmer? Bigger than everybody else. A good old friend, hieratic scale, makes it incredibly easy to read, right? So there he is, and I got a nice detail of this. There's this little servant again, right, with the sandals velcroed to his arm, and carrying, just as he was before, a little jar of holy water, probably something along those lines, ointment, right? And Narmer has in his hands that scepter that he beat the guy with. And in the other hand, he's carrying, can you see that's a whip? Which I think we've seen before in Egyptian art, right? People carrying that flail, right? And he's got it up here by his arm. And you can see the tassels coming down, right? And he's got a very different crown on at this time. But you can see that the pose is, again, that twisted perspective, where the shoulders are seen from the front, the hips from the side, the legs apart so we can see them both. Right? And you can see he's still wearing that decorative bull's tail coming off of the back of his kilt. Right? What? Yeah, go ahead. This one here? I think it's just, good question. Kings carry scepters is certainly one easy answer to that, but I think also it ties the two sides together. Right? It is the means by which he subjugated the enemy. Right? So, but at the same time, it becomes sort of normal for everybody carries a scepter if you're in control, right? And I think here that's exactly what it is. We'll talk more about the flail in just a little bit, okay? Because that is actually kind of an important symbol in ancient Egypt, and increasingly important as time goes on, okay? The crown he's wearing is identified as the crown of Lower Egypt. Remember on the front, he's wearing the crown of Upper Egypt and beating up the people of Lower Egypt, right? He's drubbing the people of the Delta region, and he comes from the south, right? Here he's put on their crown as a sign that victory has led to him taking them over. He didn't just beat them and ran away, right? He has incorporated Lower Egypt into Upper Egypt. And as we saw with some sculptures already, eventually Egyptian pharaohs will wear what's called a double crown or a composite crown. That's this tubular base of this bit with that bowling pin thing amalgamated into it, right? And it loses the doily, right, off the top of it, right? Looks like an old doorbell ringer or something like that. So there's Narmer. Now, what's he doing? Marching, right? Why do we know he's marching and not just out for a pleasant walk on a sunny Egyptian afternoon? Right. We saw one of those before, right? It was a standard, right? A military standard. So yes, they're walking in a similar pose to him. They're carrying these items on top of poles. Notice the repetition of the falcon on the first two, right? Our old friend Horus from the other side, who is so closely associated with the pharaoh. This jackal dog here is probably Anubis, who is the god of jackal god of death, right? I'm not quite sure what that is. Yeah. I think it is. I've been looking at that and trying to figure out, because I finally got some good images of this. Everything was blurry before, and I can't tell if it's a bird with its wings crossed like that. And that would seem unlikely, because when we see Horus, we tend to see him otherwise, right? But I think that the name for Narmer is up here. So the question is this the same object as that? And I think it is. Doesn't you see that up there? Between the two heads of Hathor, right? There's something at the very top of that, right? And I think that's this, so I think that's probably his name, right? In the Egyptian hieroglyph. That's thinking on my feet, right? Just that's a guess. Now, where are they walking to? What are they going to go look at? Yeah. Indeed, the enemy is defeated, and you'll notice it's fairly horrific, isn't it? They have been lined up on the ground, and again, stacked up in space, just like the food on the table that we saw with that burial stele. And their heads have been cut off. They're lying in shackles. I'd never, like I said, I finally got a good reproduction of this, but I never noticed that they had their arms bound to their sides, in probably iron shackles, and their heads placed between their legs. And you'll also notice that there's Horus again a couple times over, and there's the boat to carry them to the land of the dead, right? Carry them across the Nile. So again, a horrific scene, but the whole object is Narmer in a way claiming agency when it comes to the conquering of Lower Egypt, right? He's saying, I am the man who did it, right? I'm the one who brought these people under my subjugation. At the bottom, we see Hathor. So again, it's kind of like the front where we had Horus doing the same thing that Narmer was doing. Here on the back, we see Hathor doing the same thing that Narmer's doing. Is knocking over this guy, stepping on him. Notice he's naked. He's been debased. You see his hoo-ha. And over here, we sort of see almost like a ground plan of a citadel or a castle wall. So Hathor is helping him, if you will. He's doing what Hathor is doing. And that includes knocking down the barriers, right? Conquering. Again, this interest in using over and over again these ground lines everywhere we look, right? Hathor doesn't just float, but we get a place for her to stand. So that, again, very much like the front in that respect. In the center, right? What's going on here? What are these things? Hard to identify the animals, right? Giraffes, I heard. Except they have lions' heads, right? So it doesn't really make sense. Why do you think the artist has made this sort of hybrid creature that doesn't seem to exist in things that, you think things like this were walking around ancient Egypt? Highly unlikely, right? So what's the point? What's the artist trying to communicate here with this? Because it takes up a lot of real estate, doesn't it, in the middle of that? It makes a nice design, doesn't it? It gives you that little well to put the makeup in if you're ever going to use it, right? It makes that so you get that nice circular bit in the middle. But why? What's going on here? Probably exactly right. To unify Upper and Lower Egypt being unified, right? And the idea that each of the animals is pretty much exactly the same, but in reverse. Exactly. Just like a yin and yang, they echo that. And each of them is being held in restraint now, right? Not only Lower Egypt, but Upper Egypt as well, because we're at peace, right? This has brought unification, and unification brings the end of fighting. So our two slave figures hold the necks of those figures. And you can even see the detail in the woven rope that holds the neck of each. You had your hand up. The guys in the back. That's a really good question. I hadn't thought of that. They know how to fly, right? Yeah, they're being whipped around by the. I don't know. It's interesting because it's rare. It's a very good observation because it's very rare that you see somebody without it. Even the little servant guy on the front, right? Because you could already make. Oh, is it a class thing, right? And that's a really. Maybe they're meant to be standing on the same ground plane as the animals, just like the floating bodies in the upper right corner. You know, and instead of being up above them or behind, they're sort of meant to be behind them, right? And Egyptian art tends to like to fill up all the space with something, right? That's as good an answer as I could probably give you on that, right?
So they switch the guys around.
What do you mean?
Like switch out people to animals.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it's a long and arduous job. Your text has in the introduction this image of an earlier tomb, where all of the decorations were in wood, and because it's so dry down there, it's survived pretty well. But you'll notice here, what I wanted to talk about a bit was sort of the style of Egyptian figures, right? The figural style, the proportions that they tend to rely upon, that we've seen in almost every Egyptian work of art that we saw either Monday or today. The very, very broad shoulders, the very, very narrow waist, the elongated torso, right? Long legs, big old feet, emphasizing the same muscle structure in each, more in the forearm than in the bicep, more in the lower leg than the thigh. And this is really typical, especially for early Egyptian art, these ways of depicting the figure. And it's so typical that you would never really mistake these for coming from a different culture because they look so Egyptian. This is so typically Egyptian. It's based on a series of proportions that has been worked out, right? That there's X number of, I think they figured that the space between, they're idealizing it, right? Because not everybody's proportions are the same, right? So what they used to stylize it was that the distance from I think from the top of your eyebrow to your chin was considered to be a unit in the image, right? And then that number of units would determine how tall you are, how long the leg was, how long the arms are, how long the hands are, and so forth. And this is why they almost always have pretty much exactly the same proportions, right? It's just a matter of size differences, yeah? Now, this warps a bit later on. But here in the early period, we're seeing this rather regularized figural style, right? I thought it'd be worthwhile just chucking back in one of our Mesopotamian works where you can see that the figural style there is so very different. Even though the pose is somewhat similar, where the legs are apart, the hips from the side, the shoulders from the front, the face from the side. Right? The same convention of showing the human figure, but the musculature is different, the proportions are different. Our Egyptian figures are all built like Olympic swimmers, right? Michael, what's his name? Thank you. Right? Big old feet too, right? Big flipper feet. They said he was genetically engineered to be a swimmer. He wasn't, but he should have been, you know? And big shoulders, tiny little waist, right? It's built like a swimmer. And I don't know, who are they built? Like a shot putter or a wrestler or something, right? The people from Mesopotamia, right? This was Assyrian, right? Right. This is from Nimrod and up in the Walters. So I think by seeing these two things side by side, you can notice that even though the pose is the same, the approach to the figure is in fact very different. And while there are some realistic details here, and you can see some of the details on the robe, this is significantly more detailed as well. It also suggests a certain interplay between these two cultures. And remember that map we had up on Monday that showed that they really aren't that far apart in the grand scheme of things. And we're going to see quite a few places, quite a few instances where Egyptian art and Mesopotamian art are sort of dialoguing with one another. Yeah, Assyrian, yeah. And you'll notice the time difference, right? It's 1,800 years later. Okay. Now, beginning around the year 2600, not exactly overnight or anything, but around the year 2600, the Egyptian kings, who are called pharaohs, you all know this from the Triple Crown winner, right, which spelled it wrong like I always do. I don't know why, right? But the Egyptian kings began being buried inside of pyramids. The most famous ones, the ones on your left, just outside of Cairo in Giza, were built by 3 successive pharaohs: a father, his son, and his grandson. What we would call a dynasty. The development of these pyramids, their symbolism and whatnot, I'm going to put up a little 10-minute art fix that talks about that, right? Because it gets kind of dull in class to go over it, but so you go over it more than once if you need to. Fall asleep if that's the case, right? So the earliest of the 3 was built by the pharaoh Khufu. You'll find this spelled any number of different ways because, again, we're translating hieroglyphs into English letters, right? It's the earliest of the 3 pyramids, and it's the largest of the 3. Perspective makes it look smaller, but indeed it is by far the largest of the 3 pyramids. Right? His son, Khafra, built the middle one. And his grandson, Menkaure, built the one in the front, which is about a fourth the size of the other 2, but again, it's closer to the camera, so it looks much larger. Yeah?
Are they supposed to be smaller based on like the grandfather is the biggest, middle, and the grandfather is smaller?
I think the first 2, yes, right? We'll have a couple of things that come up with this, but for the first 2, I think that's definitely the case, that the son is... But Herodotus, the Greek historian, mentions that Menkaure died young. And that may be the case for why his pyramid is smaller. And in fact, we'll see, probably not tonight, but soon we'll see a statue of Menkaure where, in fact, we see the statues unfinished as well. So that suggests that there might have been a hurry up to get it finished. The smaller ones that you see are for other members of court. They practiced polygamy, actually, not just, they didn't stop at 2. Right? And so those are for the larger of these secondary burial structures are for the wives and consorts, right? Mistresses. Yeah.
I was going to ask, did it depend on like the range?
This is I don't know enough to answer it with any certainty. The question was, does the size, for example, because there are other pyramids, right? These ones are the largest, and that's why they're the most famous, right? And also their proximity to Cairo helps an awful lot, right? You can see them from just outside Cairo. And when I was 21, I went there. Didn't go inside, though. Stupid me, right? Yeah, I know. It was the middle of the summer. There was like 130 degrees out. Anyway, I don't know the relationship between size and status, right? I think that part of the reason these are so very large is they're really quite early in the scheme. Your text will tell you that the step pyramid of Zoser is the first one, right? And that they then progressed to these smooth-sided ones, which were even more smooth-sided to begin with, because each of them was faced with polished limestone. So it made them just smooth and shiny like the one in Vegas, right? Without the lights. Yeah, and that's all been taken because limestone's a valuable material. It's been pilfered and carved up, and who knows where it is. Maybe it's, on the steps out here somewhere. So the rubble that you see is the core that the fine limestone once faced, right? And that's all missing. I got a couple of hands. Go ahead. That's a good question. I think it might have, but I don't know for sure. I'm guessing that it probably did, because certainly if you look at it, it did have that bevel. So the steps weren't flat like steps, right? They did go up like this, right? And again, we'll talk about that a bit more in class, and I'll look into it. I'll find out before I record that. Yeah. No. Those are, again, I think I just said that was for the consorts, right? No, each one for a separate one. Like I said, they practice polygamy. And the part of it is, okay, I'm not going to justify it, right, because I'm not a polygamist. And my wife is teaching right across the hall, so this would be a horrible thing to do. But if they wanted to make sure they had an heir, right, and if wife numero uno, coming up dry, wife numero due, right, can in fact perhaps pop one out, right, so to speak. Yeah. So they are for them, and this brings up a bigger issue, which is that each of the pyramids is not an isolated structure. Each of them is part of a larger complex of buildings, which were meant to house the tombs not only of the family, right, in this case the wives and mistresses, also the sons who aren't lucky enough to be the firstborn, right? What if you're son number 2? You know, I'm not going to get it. But also for other court members would be buried in the proximity, because the whole point is that even with the pyramids, right, they're trying to replicate in the afterlife the idea that life just goes on. So there's going to be places for everybody that was part of that court to still be there, right? And the decorations, as well as the statues, are there for the soul to continue living uninterrupted by death, right, forever. And that's why they're made of stone, right? Permanent material. That's why they are surrounded by stone statues and carvings on the wall, right? Okay. So we'll talk about Zoser a little bit more online and look inside the Great Pyramid, the one of Khufu. Also in the 10-minute, I've got some nice pictures from inside that I didn't take. Yeah. Sorry? Menkore, the one with the smallest of the 3 pyramids. I'll show you next. I think the next slide is an aerial view. Yeah, and get a sense of scale differences, right? So that's the same thing we're looking at here, but this camera now is placed sort of over here, looking this direction, right? And that gives you a sense of the scale differences. Now, we don't have records to say that Menkore died early, but that's just sort of what many think, right? At least when I read about it, that's what people thought. Now, as you can see, each of these is part of a really large burial complex. So we can see those other secondary pyramids here that are showing up here, but you can also see that Khufu's got them as well. Granddad's got them here. And each one of them also has these original old, I think that's a road, but this one here is the original causeway that leads from the pyramid down to the side of the river. And that there are temples and other burial sites around it. So they aren't independent structures, but part of a larger complex. And the idea behind the complex is, again, to perpetuate the court, right? The court will go on forever. Yeah. And so there is we'll look at Khafra's pyramid because we have some nice sculpture from him. There's a temple here. Originally, this is silted in a bit, but originally the Nile was right here, and there was an inlet, right? And the boat coming from the land of the living, because this is on the side of the land of the dead, right, would come over here, big entourage like we saw in those early sculptures, right? And they would offload the pharaoh, and in this temple here, there would be a ritual for the offloading, right? Then there would be up this long covered walkway, a procession. Again, a procession up, just like in Mesopotamia, right? A procession up. And there's a secondary temple just here, where the last rituals would be performed before the body, mummified, of the pharaoh was put inside the pyramid, right? So 2 different temples as part of this procession. Yeah, hit it.
Do they take the bodies out?
Well, these ones here were gone a long, long time ago. Because, in fact, as you might imagine, this is a big beacon that says "Eat here." Yeah. So they're missing. However, it is. But at the same time, we're not that much better. You know, the Walters has a mummy from about 800 BC, and it's still in there. Right? They still got the body, and in fact, there's still a body down at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. So, and in fact, there's quite a few places. If you ever go to Egypt in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, you can also see them. And we actually have the body of King Tut You can find them online pretty easily. No, I don't have
I
it.
thought you were Smithsonian.
No. Or Marymount, right over there in that graveyard behind the. They found him there. It's wild how old this area is. Right? So the king would come into the Valley Temple, bodies preserved, right, up to the mortuary temple where the final preparations are put in before it's actually stuck inside the pyramid, right? You've seen this before, right? The Great Sphinx is sitting right next to the Valley Temple at Khafre's pyramid. Now, what do you suppose it's doing there? Guarding, exactly, right? It's protecting the temple. So it stands as this monumental guard. It's huge, right? And it's there specifically to guard the pyramid. Not this one. It's not. Is it 3 questions? I thought it was just one. The riddle of the Sphinx. I just taught this in my 19th century class. It's just one question. What walks on 4 legs when it's young, 2 legs? No, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Man, right? Because crippled and right, crawling and walking upright and using a cane. It's the riddle of the Sphinx. Just like Monty Python, and when Oedipus figures it out, right? The Sphinx then throws itself off a cliff, right? So it's very, very similar. Okay, that's not the. I don't think that's the same Sphinx. That's a woman as well. At least in most imagery, it is. Okay, so here you can see it's very badly damaged. It's very badly worn, but it's meant to be the face of Khafre, most likely. He's wearing a pharaoh's headdress, right down to the snake on the forehead. There's a small chamber inside. Most of it is raw earth, and by that I mean that it was excavated from the hole that you can see here. In other words, it's live rock, right? It's the rock of the earth up to about his shoulder level. And then the stuff that was excavated was built up on top of it to make the head, right? So part of it is reductive from the earth itself, and the other part is built up, right? And he's there specifically to guard the pyramid. One wonders again about this interplay of cultures that I was talking about before, right? When we talk about hybrid animals, the body of a beast, a ferocious beast, and the head of a leader put on it, right? That is something that we see in both of these cultures, and it certainly is not at all a coincidence. Right? I think there has to be some interplay. And they're simply adapting it from palace on one hand to burial practices on the other. Right? Okay, we'll continue, wrap up Egypt on whatever the next day we meet is. Monday? Monday. Worksheets are, Mesopotamian worksheets due tomorrow, yeah. And I'm pretty sure that with that review sheet, there is no way we're going to get through everything. Yeah.
The second question is, what is the name of the writing used by the people? So
Okay. That was Mesopotamian, right? So all of them used it in there. Yeah.
Okay. So that includes the Sumerian.
Yeah, they all use the same writing. Yeah. So we see it first. The first time we saw it was in one of the pop-up slides, but it's on in works of art that you've seen. It's on the base of those little worshiper statues, and it's on the stele of Naram Sin, and it's in the Assyrian temple as well.
That's the one with the law, right?
That's also written in cuneiform. They've all written in cuneiform. It just looks like a bunch of hash marks. Okay? So there it is. You bet. Hi. Thank you. Come over here while I'm going to turn off my recorder.
So I have a golf tournament on the day of the exam.